In the wake of the destruction of Jerusalem, the Hebrew captives living in Babylon composed countless lament psalms, such as Psalm 101, which begins by asking Yahweh why he stands so far off and hides himself from his people in their time of trouble. The purpose of these songs was to enable the people to express their grief for their current situation and to remind Yahweh of his mercy, so that, perhaps, he might withdraw his wrath from the community. These pieces of music helped to forge a bond within the community, uniting people when tragedy threatened to tear them apart, creating a sense of wholeness when their future seemed as bleak as their past. By giving voice to their pain, they found hope. And through that hope, they were able to not only create a new future for their community, but write a new history as well. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. We covered the Lamentations Psalms in episode 74, which can be divided into two subgenres, those of the individual lament and those of communal lament. But the Psalms aren't constrained to just that one book. They spill over into other material as songs and poetry are included in other books of the Bible. Here, 5 laments are gathered to create another short book of Psalms, known as the Book of Lamentations. The purpose of these 5 psalms is to serve as a source of self-reflection in time of crisis, both on communal and personal levels. The topics which our authors are concerned with are the loss of Jerusalem and the desperate suffering of its people in the aftermath. And who are those authors? Tradition holds that the 5 chapters of Lamentations were all penned by the prophet Jeremiah, but this is similar to attributing the writing of the Torah to Moses. It's little more than wishful thinking. The entirety of the Book of Lamentations makes no mention or reference to Jeremiah. None of the manuscripts are attributed to him, and there are several instances where the details contradict what is found in the Book of Jeremiah, such as the claim that all the prophets stopped receiving visions from Yahweh around the time that Jeremiah ostensibly wrote his collection of oracles. In fact, the sole reason for ascribing these songs to Jeremiah seems to come from an obscure verse in 2 Chronicles 35:25. There, the author claims that Jeremiah sang a lament for the death of King Josiah. This lament wasn't included in 2 Chronicles, nor did it reference anything found in the Book of Lamentations. But the claim is even more dubious when we recall that the books of Chronicles were works of fiction, penned as revisionist history. Their source of information were the books of Samuel and Kings. Those books were then rewritten in order to elevate the reputation of the Levitical priests. And in that source material, the books of Kings, there is no such mention of Jeremiah penning the Book of Lamentations. So these 5 psalms are anonymous songs and might not have even been written by the same individual. As for the dating of the book, it was likely written during the Babylonian exile, sometime prior to the Persian conquest, perhaps around 580 to 550 BCE. Why those dates? Because the events described, such as the destruction of Jerusalem and suffering of its people, seems fresh in the mind of the author. However, he doesn't seem to have any hope for a restoration, a theme found in writings from later decades. Also, the second part of Isaiah, which is traditionally dated to as early as 550 BCE, seems to reference parts of Lamentations. Now, this doesn't mean that that book existed in this format by that period, only that the individual lament psalms were likely in circulation by the time 2nd Isaiah was composed. Now let's talk about the book's composition. Each of the 5 chapters is a separate psalm, and each of those psalms are comprised of 22 stanzas. In chapters 1, 2, and 4, these 22 stanzas are each comprised of a single line or verse. And those 3 chapters are all acrostics, meaning the first stanza begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the second stanza begins with the second letter, and so on. Chapter 3 is also an acrostic, but each stanza is 3 verses long, for 66 verses in total. Chapter 5 is the only chapter that is not an acrostic, though it's also comprised of 22 stanzas. One final point of note before we dig into the contents is the order of the alphabet in the acrostics. During the exilic period, the Jewish community living in Babylon experienced a slight alteration to their alphabet. The order of the letters was changed. The 16th and 17th letters, Ayin and Pei, were swapped to Pei and Ayin. This is referred to as the A&P reversal. The acrostics found in Lamentations are arranged in the original order, not the post-exilic order, meaning these were either written by residents of Jerusalem who remained behind, or they were written by exiles before this reversal occurred. Now it should be noted that your Bible probably arranges those verses in that reversed order. This means that your Bible is swapping the stanzas so that the 17th stanza occurs before the 16th. This is because your Bible is likely based on the Masoretic text, and the Masoretes decided to swap those verses to coincide with their adopted order of the alphabet. But the oldest copies preserve the original order. Oh, and another final point is that these 5 songs were arranged in the wrong order. The correct order of the chapters should be 2, 1, 4, 5, and 3. Now, you'll have to forgive me here because I can't provide a source for this order. You see, the article I read, which provided the argument for this order, had been saved on my computer for later review. At least I thought it was. Apparently, I copied the order into the notes for this episode and completely forgot to include the relevant paragraphs or even a link to said article. And despite my best efforts, I've been unable to locate that particular article since the fateful closing of that tab several months ago. I do recall that one of the reasons for the arrangement was the subject matter for these chapters. If you consider them by topic, you can see a chronological sequence of events. Yahweh's wrath on Zion in chapter 2, followed by the desolation of Jerusalem in chapter 1. Then the focus shifts to the misery felt by the population of the besieged city in chapter 4, and the lamentation of the community in chapter 5. The book then culminates with the individual lament and glimmer of hope in chapter 3. I promised there was more contained within that article, but we'll have to leave those arguments behind and lament the loss of knowledge for the time being. Of course, as we've already mentioned, this is a collection of songs which were possibly written by 5 different individuals without an ongoing narrative, so the order in which we examine them doesn't actually matter. And now that I've provided ample filler for this short episode, let's get started. In chapter 2, Yahweh's wrath and Zion's ruin alternates between the voice of the poet and that of the city, which is, of course, represented by a female figure who is almost certainly the goddess Asherah, but now has been reduced to a simple personification of the city of Jerusalem. Yahweh vents his anger against the city in the first 10 verses of the poem. A common thread throughout the book of Lamentations is that the primary cause for the destruction of the city is Yahweh's wrath. According to the poets, this wasn't caused by Babylonian expansionism, but by the personal rage of their own patron deity. Yahweh's outburst of anger has cast down the woman of Zion from heaven, giving us a reference to the fallen god theology, which was featured so prominently in the Enochic material. By the close of the first verse, he has forgotten the city as his seat of governance, abandoning his throne in the temple forever, a reference to the end of the divine kingship. Following this, he lays waste to the strongholds and defenses of the land, tearing down the walls and houses alike before shaming the royalty of the nation. The horn of Israel, a symbol of its military might, is then cut off, and Yahweh withdraws his support in face of the invading army. And not only does he abandon them in their time of need, he sends the fire of his own wrath against them as he sides with the Babylonian invaders. Taking up his war bow, the symbol of his might and wrath that he has hung in the sky following Noah's flood, the national god fires arrows against his own children, slaughtering those he once considered precious before raining down fire upon the tent of daughter Zion, a reference to the destruction of the temple in which worship of Asherah was once a prominent feature. He becomes the enemy of Israel, an opposer or Satan figure standing against the nation. Remember that a Satan was an opponent in Hebrew mythology, not a cosmic evil, though the actions of both forms of this figure could appear quite similar. Yahweh's attention then turns inward, from the defenses and houses of the nation to the occupants and the temple. These shrines and temple complex are rejected by the very deity they were meant to serve, and he attacks the feast days and the Sabbaths, destroying them as he destroys the city. No longer are their religious practices worthy of the deity they honor, and neither are the priests and royalty whom he now scorns. Even the altar where his sacrifices are offered up is worthy of his wrath, as he hands over his own people to the invading army. His wrath and anger has bent him to a path of destruction against Jerusalem, and now he stretches out a measuring line against the walls of the city. This tool, typically used as a symbol of construction, is now there to signify its downfall, as the walls, gates, and bars are dismantled and smashed by the fearsome God. Prophets and elders remain silent and mournful as visions and messages from their God are now withheld. He has abandoned not only the royalty and the populace, but his own prophets and priests as well, turning his back on everyone and severing all communication, bringing a total end to prophecy. The people are left without hope, gripped by mourning as their deity vents his anger upon the whole of the nation. Beginning in verse 11, the poet speaks in the first person on behalf of the people who have suffered through this terrible ordeal, proclaiming that his eyes are spent with tears and his stomach churns. He vomits into the dust after beholding the terrible state of the people who lie broken in the streets of the city. Children cry out for their mothers for food, fainting from hunger. The horrors he has witnessed are beyond compare. The virgin goddess of Zion has been stripped naked and shamed for all to see. All who see the city shame her for her guilt and mock her for that shame. Yahweh has now carried out his threat, destroying the city without mercy or pity, and now the people mock and laugh those who dwell within her ruined walls. Her fate couldn't be averted, as it had been decided by Yahweh from days of old. So these people are being punished not for their own crimes, but for those of long-dead ancestors. The position shifts again in verse 18 as the poet now speaks to the people, encouraging them to cry out to Yahweh on behalf of their children. He speaks now in the third person, telling them to give themselves no rest, but devote all of their energy into mourning, to wail into the night, and pour out their misery before Yahweh like water. He wants them to raise up their hands in supplication for their children who starve in the street. Despite Yahweh doing all of this of his own accord and there being no escape from his wrath, they should still beg for mercy and hope that he might see their plight. Even as mothers are forced to eat their own starving children to prevent their own starvation, they should plead for that same deity who slaughtered his own priest within the temple to take pity on them. But despite their pleas, men and women, young and elderly, are cut down by the sword to slake Yahweh's thirst for violence. His wrath is without pity as their cries fall on deaf ears, and he turns their feast days into a time of terror. He summons enemies to destroy his children so that none may survive his anger. The chapter ends without a single glimmer of hope. On the contrary, the message is that Yahweh is without mercy and slaughtered his own children without the slightest pity in his heart. It's truly one of the most disturbing pieces of poetry in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. The author sounds as if he's encouraging a battered woman to beg for mercy from her abusive husband while he is actively beating her, and despite her pleas, he only intensifies the abuse until she lies dead at his feet. Forgiveness isn't in Yahweh's heart in this poem. His only emotion is rage, and he vents that rage by forcing the people to commit cannibalism before he murders them for a crime which was committed centuries earlier. Chapter 1, The Desolation of Jerusalem, is set shortly after the fall of the city. Once filled with people, now the streets stand empty. Once she was a princess, now Zion is a toiling slave. Again, the city is depicted as a woman, a return to the goddess Asherah we've encountered so many times before in this podcast. She's been demoted from prominent figure of worship to a mere allegory for Yahweh's favorite city, which now stands empty, its people taken away into exile. The roads to the city are empty of pilgrims, those people who once journeyed from across the land to visit the holy city where the Queen of Heaven was once so revered. But now her priests are gone, exiled and slaughtered by her enemies. This is the punishment visited upon the city and her children for their sins against Yahweh. But there are still a few people left behind, as we're told in verse 4. Those are some priests and young women. These are the priests who, according to later Jewish theology, are not fit to serve in Yahweh's temple, and the women who serve at holy festivals, such as those found in Judges 21:19-21 and Jeremiah 31:13. The religious order that will later come from Babylon to settle in the city will bar both groups from performing their holy rites. But here, in this earlier text, there's no such condemnation for their religious practices, because reformers have yet to outlaw them. The city recalls her former glory and the riches she once held, but now she's disgraced in defeat. Her clothes are torn, revealing her nakedness, and she's mocked for wearing skirts stained with her blood. Now we might be tempted to believe that this is just another negative portrayal of women here, and a glimpse of the horrors of war and what might occur in the aftermath of a siege, but there might be more symbolism here than appears on the surface. The woman in the blood-red skirts is certainly meant to be the disgraced city, and her blood is meant to represent the horrors inflicted upon women in times of war. But the red skirts might mean something more. Just a few verses prior, we learn that pilgrims no longer journey to the city. These pilgrims, as archaeology informs us, carried with them small clay figurines of the goddess Asherah, and the Queen of Heaven was often depicted as being adorned with riches, as this paragraph mentions her losing, and wearing scarlet robes. So I believe this verse is meant to show the disgrace visited upon the city, the horrors inflicted upon its people, and the shame inflicted upon the goddess herself. The allegory of the city's rape is complete in verse 10, as we're told that the enemy placed his hand on her precious things, and that the nations enter her sanctuary. At this point, the people identify with the humiliated woman of Zion, begging Yahweh to see them and how they have been demeaned, and take notice of the ruthless horrors inflicted upon them. Their pain is beyond compare, and no one else has ever suffered so much at the hands of Yahweh. So great is her misery that a single glance is all that would be required to inspire pity, and thus it would turn Yahweh's heart to mercy. But he has abandoned her, and isn't around to see her pain. The reader, or rather the singers and audience, are now experiencing this for themselves. No longer is the poem about the city depicted here from the eyes of the onlookers. Now it's about the population itself, and vocalized as a personal experience. Rather than say, "the city wept," they say, "I have cried out," and "I have suffered." With them inside the city is death and the sound of mourning, and there is none to bring comfort. The injured and insulted populace gives voice to its agony and begs only that Yahweh visit the same wrath against their enemies. They've given up on the idea of mercy, and now hope only for vengeance. Like the first two chapters we've covered, chapter 4 bears no sign of hope as it describes the miseries within the city. The gold and other precious metals are scattered, the people are broken. We find something odd in verse 3, though. The text tells us that the people have been abandoned by comparing their situation to that of abandoned nests. It reads, "Even jackals offer their breasts to nurse their young, but the daughter of my people is as cruel as the ostrich in the wilderness." You see, since ostriches make their nests on the ground, some ancient people believed these nests were simply abandoned. I suppose they wanted ostriches to be climbing around up in trees. We hear that children suffer from thirst and starvation, while those who once had pale skin from luxurious indoor living are now sunburnt from toiling away outside. They wish that they had died by the sword rather than feel the agony of hunger, and say that once compassionate women have boiled and eaten their own children, another reference to cannibalism. And all of this is happening because Yahweh decided to vent his wrath against the city of Jerusalem. In verse 12, the focus shifts away from the inhabitants of the city and toward the priests and prophets as the author works his way up the social ladder. These are the people who led the residents astray and bear the blame for their sins. While external enemies were unable to enter the city because of its mighty walls, these priests and prophets have destroyed it from within. Injustices were committed, causing innocents to suffer because of the crimes of those in power. They defiled themselves, and so Yahweh withdrew his protection from Zion. Here the presence of Yahweh is seen as a magical shield which defends the city, and as soon as it is removed, the walls are easily breached. Now the people are exhausted from weeping and hoping for aid which isn't coming, begging for an ally to assist, but none have helped. This is a reference to Egypt, whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem relied on for help when the Babylonians threatened to besiege the city, and sent an army to discourage the invaders, but ultimately failed to prevent the downfall of Jerusalem. The author shifts focus again, this time to the king, and here Yahweh's wrath is depicted as a great hunt as the invaders pursue their quarry for sport. They're swift as eagles, chasing the king on his trail as he attempts to flee. Try as he might, his path ends in the wilderness as they surround him and bring him down. But this isn't just any king. This is Yahweh's anointed one, the divine king, his Messiah who serves as the breath of life for the people. He's captured in their snares and dragged away to his fate. We find a similar scene in Psalm 57:6 that describes how an enemy dug pits and set snares as the person was hunted like a wild animal. Remember that this language is common in the lament psalms that we covered earlier. Oddly enough, their enemy is named in verse 21, and it isn't the Babylonians, but the neighboring Edomites. So what are we to make of this oddity? It's actually explained quite easily. While the Babylonians were the ones responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem, their neighbors weren't free of guilt. Following the city's downfall, they became prey for their neighbors, such as the Edomites. This is referenced in several places, such as in Jeremiah 49, where their neighbors are punished for attacking Jerusalem while it was weak, or Ezekiel 35, which calls for their destruction for attacking during a time of need. Though perhaps the most famous is Psalm 137, which served as the inspiration for the hit song By the Rivers of Babylon. Near the end of that song are verses which no contemporary gospel singer would ever consider for inclusion in their music. It calls for Yahweh to punish the enemies of Israel just as he once punished them, including attacking Edom and bashing the heads of their babies against the rocks. As we saw earlier in this episode, the chapter ends not with a glimmer of hope for a better future, but one which begs for their enemies to be as miserable as the author. In the previous chapters, the poems were addressed to the people or the city which represented them, but in chapter 5 that all changes. Here, our poet is speaking directly to Yahweh himself. This shouldn't come as a surprise, as we've seen this before in the Psalms, which frequently implored Yahweh to notice their plight and thus move him to action. The same is found here. The psalm begins by reminding Yahweh what has happened to them, or more accurately, what he has done to them. Their homeland is now inhabited by foreigners, and the people have become like orphans. They're forced to buy water and wood from those who now dwell in Judah. Food must be purchased from a more powerful nation like Egypt or Assyria, and they suffer the punishments for the sins of their deceased ancestors. People suffer from the extreme heat while they travel to find food, and women are raped in the cities. Royalty, once proud and secure, are now mistreated and executed, while the young men are crushed beneath the weight of heavy burdens that they must carry. The elders who once gathered near the gates to make city decisions and pass judgments, as we saw in chapter 4 of Ruth, have now abandoned that role, and the young men no longer play music. Their hearts are bereft of joy, and their festivals have turned into occasions of mourning. They voice their anguish and grief to Yahweh, reminding him of the horrors he's committed against them for the sins of their ancestors while he sits on his lofty throne, until finally, Near the end of the psalm, they call him to action and state what they wish him to do. They beg for him to turn them back toward him so they might return and be free of his wrath. I do my very best to remove the bulk of my personal opinions from these episodes, but I can't help but see this as a battered partner begging for their abuser to relent from their beatings as they promise to be more obedient this time around. In the end, these poems grant us a glimpse into the minds of the authors, and the people who wrote the songs contained in this book were not only suffering, but honestly believed that their anguish was well deserved. Finally, we come to chapter 3, the longest psalm in the book that spans 66 verses, the voice of a suffering individual. Its position in the middle of the book is meant to serve as a turning point, and by placing the longest psalm in the middle, it brings symmetry to the collection by having this poem bookended by pairs of psalms with 22 verses each. Unlike the other psalms, this isn't a communal lament where the people of the city give voice to their affliction, but an individual lament where a singular figure sings of his anguish. In fact, the author is so interested in the topic of inner suffering at the hands of Yahweh that we find almost no reference to the suffering of the nation or community. It begins with the statement, "I am one who has known affliction under the rod of God's anger," which sounds like a pretty awesome opening line for a novel. He goes on to say that Yahweh turns against him and him alone, over and over again. His flesh has been worn away and all of his bones are broken as he's besieged by hardship and poverty. No longer is the city an abused woman, but the speaker himself who represents the whole of Judah. Like the hunted people from before, he's surrounded and trapped, then bound in chains. Even the straight path he's meant to walk has been made crooked by Yahweh, who sets him up for failure. God then uses the poet for target practice, firing arrows into his body and piercing his organs, with a return to the familiar war god imagery we've come to expect when Yahweh's wrath becomes the focus. He's taunted and ridiculed by his neighbors. Much of the imagery we find here in the first section of this chapter reminds us of the book of Job, especially as he describes his grief. His life is deprived of peace, and he's forgotten the feeling of happiness. Even his enduring hope has perished under Yahweh's relentless wrath. Despite all of this, he still hopes that acts of mercy and compassion from Yahweh haven't been exhausted, and that his fortunes might eventually change. This is his only hope, that if he continues to seek Yahweh, he might one day be delivered, because, as he states in verse 31, Yahweh does not reject forever. Until then, he must eat dust and offer his cheek to be struck. This eating of dust is the punishment of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and the fate of defeated kings who have been captured by their enemies. In verses 34 to 36, we find an important detail that we must discuss. It reads, that someone tramples underfoot all the prisoners in the land, or denies injustice to anyone in the very sight of the Most High, or subverts a person's lawsuit. Does the Lord not see? So it's rhetorically asking if Yahweh notices the injustices within his own land. But that isn't the important part. It's the two names that are mentioned in verses 35 and 36. These things are carried out before the Most High, and then he asks if Yahweh has seen them. We have here two separate gods mentioned in the same sentence. He didn't say that these things happened in the sight of Yahweh, and then ask if Yahweh notices. He said that they happened before El Elyon, and he then asked if Yahweh took note. This isn't the first time we've seen these two gods interacting. It first occurred in Deuteronomy 32:8, when El Elyon, the God Most High, divided the nations of the world amongst his sons, and he gave his favorite nation, that of Israel, to Yahweh as his inheritance. So Lamentations 3:35-36 reminds us that Yahweh and the God Most High were originally two separate deities. We also see a reference to the idea that both good and evil are the work of their patron deity that we encountered in Isaiah 45:7, when the poet says that he is responsible for both good and bad in verse 38. So he seeks to examine his own actions and sins in the hopes of returning to Yahweh. He has rebelled and hasn't yet been forgiven, so Yahweh pursues and kills without pity. We find another curious passage in verse 44, when he says that Yahweh has wrapped himself in a cloud which no prayer can pierce. In the temple, the presence of incense smoke symbolized the presence of Yahweh. At this time, the high priest could commune with their patron god. Now, in a classic reversal, that cloud is depicted as a separation from Yahweh, a physical boundary that prevents the passage of prayer. So now they're harassed by enemies and weep constantly over their destruction until the time comes when Yahweh will once again look down from the heavens and see their plight. He calls upon the name of Yahweh from the bottom of the pit where he lies ensnared, lost deep beneath the waters. This is the primordial abyss meant to symbolize death and Sheol. His plight is then presented before Yahweh like a court case as he accuses the deity of injustice. See, Yahweh, how I am wronged. Then he challenges the god to do justice by him, which is the god's purpose, to see justice done. For Yahweh to ignore his plight would make him a hypocrite. He then attempts to shift Yahweh's rage to his taunting neighbors who mock him for his miserable state, and concludes the poem by inviting Yahweh to curse them with wrath. So Yahweh is seen as both the curse and the cure, and the poet hopes to offer up someone else as the object of Yahweh's cruel wrath so that he might turn his anger away from Judah and toward their neighbors, presumably the Edomites. When Yahweh is angry, someone has to suffer, and the poet is tired of being God's punching bag. And maybe, if that happens, it'll be a sign that they've returned to the good graces of their patron God. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.